Buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Gerardo Canedo y junto con Silvia Grampone estamos hoy aquí de anfitriones en este Ask Me Anything de seguridad con GeneXus, DevSecOps, SCA, Security for Mission Critical Systems. Antes de dar paso a lo que son las preguntas, vamos a hacer una pequeña introducción con Silvia sobre algunas cosas que tienen que hacer a la seguridad.
Regarding app security, we believe that it is both part of products as well as processes. You can't just achieve a safe app or a safe system if you don't have the right tools and if you don't have the right processes that will perform the security tasks that are required to make everything work well. Today, we'll be speaking a bit more about processes and everything that is a bit more related about how to make something safe or for it to meet certain requirements. That will be with me. And then if it's about the GeneXus products and the benefits that we offer for security, that's going to be Sylvia's task. So this is the way in which we will work together with my colleague. Okay, so security. We always say that for an application to be safe or a system to be safe, we need a safe development cycle. This means we need to think about security from the very moment in which we start conceiving the need to implement an IT system to solve a problem. That needs to be from day one. What are the security goals of your application? Who might be affected by our application? Who might have an interest in attacking it in one way or another? Who could be your rivals, or what could be potential targets from outside attacks? So when you plan the project from the very beginning, you need to think about tasks and timelines as part of this development process, this development cycle that will be allocated to security. If you think about hacking ethics, just at the end, you might run into a couple of things that you don't want to run into, and that may cause some delays and some setbacks that will add up. So from the onset, you need to plan both security activities on the one hand, and also why not to begin working on security requirements. Not every application will have the same requirements. With Genexis, for instance, we can implement a number of security requirements at different levels of security. And that doesn't mean that these are right and these are wrong, but rather they will depend on a number of factors. It depends on the business itself, on the information assets with which you're working to determine which are the right assets or the most appropriate assets. So not every system will have the same security level as others. And when you start planning your project, it's paramount that you take this into account. Then the execution phase of the project. This is where you start adding safe development tasks. For example, threat moderation. You need to understand the architecture of your system. You need to understand what are the weaknesses that are not related directly to the code or to the GeneXus knowledge base, but you may have some vulnerabilities in terms of design, which is something that should come up in this phase. And then when it comes to building the application, you have GeneXus. So there is a number of things that GeneXus will do for you, but you, as a developer, you will be the pilot of that airplane, that you can always switch off the autopilot because you need to work with some functionality that needs to be carried out by yourselves. Or perhaps you're implementing a business logic, which is what we do when we develop with GeneXus, and that might be also the place to insert some other functionalities. So that is why you have external code analysis, you have test security, you have a lot of tasks and things that you can do for you to make sure that you're actually meeting the security requirements that you had planned. Then you move on to the testing phase. This could involve a safety testing, some hacking ethics, and the idea of these testing phases to validate what you've done. And if there is something that is not so good, you can always fix it. this shouldn't be the first security phase of the whole of the construction of your system, because this could entail some very, very significant risks if you should run into some design issues. Then you have the implementation phase. That is when you get things going and you have some hacking ethics on the infrastructure. You verify that the application that you are developing is hosted within an environment that is safe enough, that is secure enough. And as time goes by, you might find new things in your application from the industry, for instance, in terms of cybersecurity, new potential threats or attacks, and you might need to take into account some extra activity, some maintenance work that you need to carry out with the system. Finally, when it comes to the closing phase of the project, you need to learn from the lessons that you've had. What will you do in your following project, and what should be improved or changed so as to guarantee a more efficient and effective work in the future? So what does Genexus do for you? This is when Sylvia jumps in. So Sylvia, the floor is yours. Hello, good morning. So at Genexus, we have a GAM, which is an asset manager. It basically works with the access control in your applications. You can specify whether that is through authentication or clearance, authorization. So in each panel, you will declare that application, the controls and the permits that you need for each case. And then in terms of the safe and secure development process, we have something that is called security scanner, which can be used by the developer themselves, or it can be automated in a panel, in a pipeline. This security scanner will help you to find things, look for things that could represent a vulnerability in your code. A very simple example would be, for example, SQL injections that GeneXus will generate in your code. You have the sentence with the right parameters that are not injectable, but if the developer inserts a SQL command, and then it basically changes it to a final user, an end user outside the application, then you can have some trouble. So security scanner will look at those commands to see whether or not you can have an injection on that command if the application has it. There is a course on this that you can find on GeneXus Consulting that goes through all the different kind of attacks that we know could happen to a GeneXus application. We teach about safe development and secure development for GeneXus itself, and it teaches you how to use security scanner and each of the rules that this issue has and how to validate and classify the positive triggers. So now Q&A session.
Bueno, para hacer preguntas pueden habilitar el micrófono.
If you have any questions, please feel free to open your mics.
Sí,
No,
hola.
dale,
Hola.
adelante, César. Adelante, te
Sí.
escuchamos.
Yeah, Cesar, go ahead. We hear you loud and clear.
Security scanner.
Okay, so security scanner,
Hemos intentado utilizarlo.
we have tried to use it in several applications, and we found that when you run it initially, it basically throws reports willy-nilly. And when you apply a pattern, for instance, the first objects that you will have observed are pattern objects and GAM objects. Are there any good practices in this sense to activate security scanner? Yeah, I have a question. What version are you using? Because you know that you have the extension, and then you have the last updates. Yeah, we're using the update 17 and update 16 as well. In update 16 as an extension and embedded for the 17 update. Okay, if it is the 16 update, you will have the execution on all the GeneXus objects. I don't really remember by heart when you have the executions on GeneXus owned objects, but that should definitely reduce that thing that you were saying, which are kind of annoying. I don't really remember that by heart right now in which upgrade that was implemented, but I think it was in the 17th upgrade. Yeah, Cesar. Still, if you get some false positives from the security scanner, well, that's unavoidable. Any static code analysis tool in the industry, regardless of the technology that you're using, any of those tools will always have some false positives. What you need to do, or what we do at least, is the first time that you run it, you go through all the false positives, and then in the subsequent times that you run the code, the findings that you have already been through, you don't take those into account. So as Silvia was saying, if you have, for example, a finding on a GAM object or on a Genexus object, those have been already analyzed by Genexus, so you should just like disregard them. But security scanner will detect, it doesn't detect vulnerabilities. That is a key part of this. What security scanner detects are hotspots. These are red flags. So not everything that appears that you will see there is necessarily a problem or an error. You need to go through, you need to analyze the context where you find that to decide whether or not that is a problem. What security scanner does since U3 is the fact that you can, the first time that you run it, every object is you can decide which objects to scan and which objects not to. Yeah, but my fear there is that I start, moving a lot of things onto the whitelist, and maybe someone touches that object and there is some vulnerability added to it, and then it will just siphon through. So that's the issue. Yeah, what you're saying is correct. So what we do nowadays is we do this manually. We take a look at the date of something that is included on the whitelist and the time that it was last updated, and we take note of that. Okay, so would you recommend as a good practice to have a member of my team dedicated to going over the security scanner reports? Would that be okay on a daily basis, let's say? Yes. I mean, it's a good idea. Probably I would try to automate things a bit more. So when, for example, when the object is consolidated, perhaps I would take a look at them there, and I wouldn't run the security scan for all the code every day. Yeah, but in our scheme, we have our pipelines on Jenkins, and we run the security scanner with the objects. So we take a look at 2 days back with our commits, and then we pick the object. We collect the information using Elasticsearch, and we have it, let's say, there at hand so that we can just analyze it. But that would be roughly what we do. It would be about someone constantly checking that whitelist at least once a week. Yeah, well, but what you can do is you can get the previous, you have one status, you analyze it, you reach the conclusion that it's safe as it is. And then in the upcoming scans, what you do is you compare what was in the safe scan, then that is a false positive because you've already analyzed that. And in the new one, you will only analyze the variability, the delta. Yeah, well, but it's hard work, isn't it? Yeah, static code analysis, whichever tool you use, it's going to be hard work because it's, this technology has some limitations. It doesn't really know whether it's a false positive or if it is a real positive. So if you can just maybe, remove some rules and run fewer rules, that would be great. But the trade-off is that maybe something is getting through that you should be checking out. So yeah, what you're saying is correct. It poses a lot of work. Yeah, perhaps it would be cool to have a list of rules that can't get through. For example, with a SQL code that you were just saying. Yeah, you can set that up yourself on Security Scanner, but the rules that you have for Security Scanner are the rules that we consider are things that shouldn't get through, but perhaps you have, based on what you observe, depending on the development of your application itself, you may feel that it has a low rate of findings, and perhaps you can disable that and run it only at regular intervals. So yeah, but the rules that you will find there are the most recommended ones, the basic ones.
Gracias, César. ¿Alguna otra pregunta del
Thank
público?
you, Cesar. Have we got any other question from the audience?
Bueno, si no hay, yo tengo acá una que me hicieron llegar.
Okay, I've got one question that I got from Jaime that says, using GeneXus, do I have a secure application? Where should I start? It's very basic, but no, not necessarily. You know, GeneXus tries to make safer applications, but developers need to take into account the best practices in terms of GeneXus programming as well. Where should you start? Well, perhaps with what Gerardo was saying, by having a safe development cycle and knowing what the best safe programming practices are for GeneXus. Yeah, in my opinion, where would I start? I would start with the security course. I would be very pragmatic. I think that the safe development course by GeneXus, it's an official course that it shows developers how the OAS top 10 looks like when you develop with GeneXus. So maybe as part of your technical or university degree, you had some development classes and you don't really know much about security concepts, which are in part the authentication and authorization processes and GAM itself, but there are other topics like such as insecure direct references, misconfigurations, different types of injections, all the adept scripting, a lot of things that you can, a lot of vulnerabilities that you can come across. And as part of these vulnerabilities, there is an international standard that it's called OS Top 10 that it aims to find the top 10 risks that have a greater impact on application. Yeah, I have a question about that that I got. Can GeneXus help me to meet the requirements of the OS Top 10? Yeah, absolutely. I know that what I'm going to say might sound a bit controversial, but I will say it anyway because I have enough evidence to prove my claim. And applications that you develop with GeneXus is much less vulnerable than an application developed with any other language if you didn't take into account security from the start in either of them. And if you want to get a safe application or a secure application with GeneXus, that will require much less effort than if you use any other development tool. So yes, absolutely. Okay, a comment. We have the link to the course that Gerardo has just mentioned. I have a question from Virginia. It says, what controls does GeneXus do to avoid the NSQL injection? Okay, so we have the automatic queries, which are queries with parameters for GeneXus. We don't work with injections. You will use SQL functions when you're using the SQL command only. Okay, I'm going to tell you a true story. I will withhold the names, but GeneXus does things really well. In particular, we have some systems in which you have all the parameters for the queries that are still vulnerable to SQL injection. So where is the main pain point? In the order by. When someone has an order that can be modified, and by that, by getting it bottom up or top down, you can have SQL injections even when your queries have parameters. So GeneXus has that wide array of attacks on SQL injections previously developed in a correct way. So the code that GeneXus builds is SQL injections proof, Even when you're talking about order buys or where and when queries, which will change the query that you're making, all of that has been cleared for GeneXus. And unless you just switch off the autopilot, you can be 100% sure that you will not run into that kind of difficulty.
Perfecto.
Great, thanks.
Por ahí mencionaste sobre el security scanner.
So you were talking about security scanner a couple of minutes ago, and Jaime is asking me another question about that. What are the benefits of using security scanner in this case? Controlling the security of applications on any potential vulnerability that could be injected by developers.
¿Alguna pregunta del público? Porque estoy
Any questions from the audience? Because I feel like I'm hogging things with the questions that we have.
Bueno, sigo yo con una más. Una
Okay, then I have another one. One from Federico.
Las mejores prácticas para
What are the best practices to try to detect sensitive data in my application? Respecting the algorithms in force, for instance, on a wiki, on the security API documentation, in the cryptographic modules, you have information on the last unit documentation on algorithms in force. Yeah, and there is another thing that I would say is important as well from a consulting point of view. When we get this kind of question, we always do some research and we ask, what do you want that information for? Because it's not the same thing if you want to store a credit card number and to store a password or an information that is going to be picked by a different system. So there are different kinds of algorithm families and mechanisms that heavily rely on what the use will be. So what is the problem that you want to overcome? The world of cryptography is vast, and there are three important things about this. First, you need to know whether or not someone knows something. So this is something a bit more like a hash. Then you need to save something to be used later. So you tend to use symmetric key algorithms. That means that you can just save it, dismantle it, and get it back together. Then you have public and private cryptography, which means that perhaps you need to save something, you need to validate that someone has done something, and then you're not going to be able to set it up again or dismantle it yourself, and then it's going to be a problem. So what Silvia was saying is that for you to overcome those different business needs, you will have different algorithms, some of which we know to be safe, or at least are thought to be safe today. And we also know that some of them are a bit more dated and that any attacker can easily get through them. So best practices include using algorithms with no key, and also to determine what is the type of cryptography that you need for the problem that you want to solve. Well, I have one last question that I got. So we have Carolina. It says, what considerations should I take into account when I deploy my application from a security point of view? Okay, so the deployment stage is quite an interesting point because we have a number of things that we need to consider, some of which will be very much solved by GeneXus and some of which are completely unrelated to what GeneXus can do for you. For those of you, for those that GeneXus is involved with, you have deployment units. One of the security issues that you may find is that you're making more objects or functionalities available to the attackers than the minimum functionalities that you need to get the application running. So for example, if you have a site, a website, and you're working with a backend, you have to, well, you can publish that backend just within your organization and the front end outside your organization. That would mean 2 deployment units in GeneXus. So it's really important to use these deployment units to segment the application and be able to effectively deploy only what you need to deploy. And then you will have some devices that you can use in development, such as developer's menu, which is not a great practice sometimes, but you can also have some test objects or trial objects that you need when you're testing your application, but that shouldn't get to the production environment. And then you have good deployment practices that are not just specific to Genexis, such as, for example, HTTPS or configuring things on the server in a good way, working with updated versions of the database server for the web server. So sometimes web and mobile applications are published through WAF, which is Web Application Firewall. So these are all good practices that we always recommend. Okay, I have a couple of questions from Elias David. It says, the tool allows us to select a number of objects with which you want to run the security scanner. Yes, the answer is yes. And then he asks again, is it possible to submit an application made in Genexus with a vulnerability and code quality analysis software, such as SonarQube or Fortify? Yes, you may, but then that will mean a lot of work when you're going through the results, right? Yeah, but of course you can do that. Yeah, and then Elias asks again, you run it on demand, but not one by one without selecting a gallery. Well, no, you can't do that, but I'm jotting that down as a suggestion to be implemented later on. Yeah, in terms of static code analysis, one of the challenges that you have to overcome if you're using one of the tools that you mentioned, is that after the analysis that you get, you'll have a code that you need to translate into a Genexus application for it to be corrected and understood, because in the same way that you will get a false positive with your security scanner, the same thing applies to a lot of other tools. So oftentimes you find that a lot of these very long reports have a very high false positive index. So it is a very, very daunting task. And what you need to do is first you run an analysis with a security scanner. And if you want to use one of these tools later on, then the number of findings will be a bit smaller, because the findings rates of security scanner is usually higher than these tools, of course, within Genexus environments. Okay, I have a question from Carlos. He says, by encrypting URLs or working with apps, do you have mechanisms to improve the application security that is in line with OWASP top 10? Okay, so when it comes to encrypting URLs, yes, because what it's doing is it's avoiding direct unsafe relations, which is maybe, you know, by changing a parameter, you're getting something that you shouldn't be getting. So for that to happen, you need to have a couple of problems. For example, an absence of data control. But this is something that you usually spot. So yes, it does help you to encrypt your URLs to avoid unsafe direct references, but it requires that you change the encryption code for your URL in each environment. In production, you need to use one encryption that is specific to production, which is a good practice. And that does go hand in hand with the OWASP's top 10. Related to the other point, I would say that maybe Carlos, I would like to know whether you're talking about a web application or a mobile application. Okay, mobile. Okay, a mobile app. Okay, so if you're working with a mobile application, that will help you with the security standard, because you have a mobile top 10, but it's not so useful. But you have an OWASP top 10 as well, which is the MASBC. And then the shrouding of the application in that case, it's at a level that is called level R, which is not necessarily security. What it does is it slows your attackers down. The attacker will have to do much more work to attack your application, but the information is still there. So if the information is available and you have someone on the other side that has enough time and enough determination, then probably they will still be able to carry out the attack. It does help you, but it's not a security control itself. It's more of a security mechanism, a defense mechanism. Okay, Gabriel from the US is asking us, by using GX test, can you use it specifically to validate not opening security holes with Jenkins deployments? Sorry, I have almost zero experience using GX test for security analyses. So yeah, no, neither do we. So that's not the way we use it. Yeah, we don't use GX test for security analyses. For static security analyses, we use security scan, and for dynamic analyses, we use our own tools, which are not GX test. Okay, we have another question from Gabriel. He says, is there a way to automate the security scanner reports generation by using a GX server or Jenkins pipeline? Yeah, with MSC build, you can use Jenkins. Yeah, you can. Yeah, the Jenkins pipeline, what you do there is you have a task that it's the DKB, and then you run the security scanner on another pipeline task through the MSC build, and then you create your reports. Pablo is asking us about the course. It says, in the course that you're recommending, are there any practical exercises of how to implement security with these topics that we are discussing, or is everything theoretical? The security course is 60% theoretical, 60% practical and 40% theoretical. What does this mean? That as a student, you will have a virtual machine that you will be sharing with a course mate, and you will get a theoretical explanation. You will know what you need to do as a developer, and then you move on to a practical exercise. First, it consists of attacking an application, understanding how you attack an application, and then you need to fix the problem. You need to make it safer than you found it. So the answer is definitely yes. It's a full hands-on security course. Xiomara is asking you, is Genexis aligned on web and mobile to the OWASP top 10 with the 2021 version? No, not yet. Well, my answer is a bit more optimistic. The 2021 OWASP top 10, I'm actually translating it at the moment. It came out not long ago, so it's basically the 2017 top 10, and basically they got some of these points and they added a couple of more things, one of which includes secure design. What happens when you didn't think your application from the beginning from a secure point of view, which is outside the development in Genexis itself, but more related to the development cycle, this safe and secure development cycle that we were talking about at the beginning. So my short answer is yes, it is definitely aligned. If you have any challenge in the 2021 top 10 that you can't implement on Genexis, please do not hesitate to let us know, to reach me personally. I'm absolutely at your service to provide any support that may be needed together with the whole Genexis team, because we are absolutely certain that we have worked enough to be absolutely aligned with this, and there is absolutely nothing new in the 2021 version that we haven't considered before in Genexis. Maybe, you know, the word that it's the layout is a bit different, but nothing is extremely innovative in terms of if you compare it to the 2017 version. Carlos asks us, does Genexis encrypt offline databases both when they are static and when they are in transition? Well, for mobile, you have the functionality in Genexis to cipher mobile databases, yes. If you were talking about a web server, then the DBMS that you're using, the database, definitely needs to have the functionality of storing information in an encrypted way. All the DBMS should have that functionality implemented in one way or another. It's a bit older as a mechanism, and it's related to having your database in an encrypted hard drive. But yeah, you can do that. And in terms of the transition of information, That is one of the things that we usually mention whenever we talk about safe development and safe design. The fact that you're using HTTPS, so to put it in a simple way, the encrypted version of the communication algorithms that you use, LADP or HTTP or JDBC, whatever you're using, for whatever reason you're using it, then the fact that the channel is encrypted is not part of the development per se. That is not something that you will find on Genexus. It's part of the environment where you're running your application. So that is always beyond the code that is generated by the tool. Cesar asks us, are there any good practices to deploy services fronts and backends in Genexus deployment units? Okay, a good practice that I recommend and I follow is this one. Actually, you can find it in the ACBS of OWASP, which is to segment the application. If you know that your system will have 4 totally different publics that are accessing the application from different parts, the best thing that you can do is you segment the application, in this case, in 4 components. Deployment units, will they help you with the segmentation? That means that you have a deployment unit with the main objects that are part of the front end, another one with your REST services, another with your backend. And then you may have one with GAMS backend or using GAMS backend compiled. But deployment units will help you to segment this. And when you do this, then Genexus will only pick the necessary code to carry out this business function, ignoring other possible Genexus objects that could be in your database but are not necessary. Okay, any other questions? Okay, any comments, anything that you feel was not asked, or any case that you would like to tell us about, Gerardo? Those cases in which you withhold your names, but maybe could be relevant to shed some light.
Si alguien quiere prender la cámara.
Yeah, I would love to see if anyone feels like you know, turning on the cameras and talking to us for a while. I promise that it won't bite, and neither will Sylvia. We're a bit shy still.
No, yo para contar puedo tener algún caso.
Okay, I may have a couple of cases to share with you. Gerardo, I have a question. Hey, this is Elias. So I have a question. I understand that when you run the processes on security scanner and you have a number of values or warnings or notifications of the vulnerabilities or the bad practices that appear in the code or development errors for each of the objects, is this something that you can get in a web format or perhaps through a report for it to show it to your client? Let's say that you're working with an application for a client and you say, we ran a security scanner and this is what we got. So this could be like a plus. Yeah, if you run it on MSCS build, you will have you know, you will have a report that you can show. It's not impossible, but it takes some work. Yeah, I wanna be very precise on this. What security scanner identifies are findings, points of interest. By no means can you think that everything that appears in security scanner is wrong, or everything that you get there is a false positive. This applies to any kind of static code analysis tool, because what you don't find in a tool sometimes means nothing. Let me tell you briefly about a case that is based on a true story. I was going through an application because what happens is that sometimes what a tool does, well, you can also do it as a human being. So as a best practice, what we do is a little bit of that, a little bit of an application, we take a look at it manually with our own eyes. And apart from the access points or some issues where you know that you could have a very serious problem for the business, we do that manually usually. And then one day I was going through this part of the code, and I saw that there was a tool that they had used a tool that was quite good, and there was a variable that was called Juan Carlos. I'm sorry, Juan Almache, if you're Juan Carlos, but there was a password and there's a Juan Carlos variable. And then, of course, when I saw that, I was a bit spooked, first of all, because that is wrong from a security standpoint. But then if the password is wrong, when it moves on to production, the whole system will fall. So that was appalling. And I started digging until I got to why the name was Juan Carlos. And the name of the variable was Juan Carlos because if you wrote password as a name, then it would just show up when you had the static code analysis. So they basically just changed the name and they called it Juan Carlos, which is a completely random name, so that it wouldn't show up or pop up when you run these analyses. So this is how absurd sometimes things can be. This static code analysis tool, you always need to interpret them. It's good to have reports saying that you ran the tool and you got this, but it's also important to interpret things to say, this is what we found from this was corrected, this was considered a false positive, and we also did this and this and that. And so it's like when you get your x-ray to your doctor and the doctor also wants to know more about the x-ray, and that adds a lot of value because having allocated that analysis time is much more valuable than just like systematically running the tool. Thank you so much. Yeah, we have taken a look at a lot of results, and most of what you get in your tools are false positives, well above 90%. So what I was going to comment actually was the password variable, a variable that is called password, or maybe have a tag that is called password that you want to display on the screen. That's going to come out in a static code analysis tool, regardless of whatever you're using. It's going to pop up, and that doesn't make it a bad practice. With security scanner, you will have the same thing. You will see when you're manipulating, for example, your JSON or your XML, that's not a bad practice, but it still pops up. What it's telling you is that this could be a potential place for injection, but it doesn't make it a bad practice. Yeah, actually manipulating XML or JSON in practice is where we find the greatest number of false positives using security scanner. The things that we also find some true positives. When someone, for example, works with a string replay and a front JSON again, you have a toString replace, and then you work with this kind of pattern, that is the kind of pattern that could result in a JSON or an XML injection. But if you're doing just a two JSON and that is not manipulated in between, because it's not foreseen for you to do that, then you won't have any issues. And that is the kind of false positive that is good to actually just like try to tackle and analyze in advance so that you can avoid it. Yeah, Silvia Gerardo, a question. Are you aware of the Veracode agreement? Could you give us some details about that? Yeah, we entered a partnership with Veracode. We're at the first stages of integration as part of the tooling's development process. The first part of this is to improve GeneXus security, and then we hope that as a consequence, we will have fewer false positives in the upcoming results that you do with your GeneXus application. But yeah, that is a long-term work that we are conducting. Yeah, it takes a lot of work, and we are working with integration already,
Más o menos.
but
sí.
it's in its first early stages.
¿Alguna otra pregunta, comentario?
Any other questions, comments?
Gerardo, Silvia.
Deseoso por escuchar a los colegas.
Gerardo, Silvia? Yeah, I'm eager to hear what you have to say and ask.
Bueno, parece que no hay más consultas.
Okay, it seems that we have no further questions.
Bueno, si no hay más consultas, vamos a ir cerrando, a menos
Okay, so
algún comentario de cierre.
we're gonna wrap this session up then, unless you want to make any further comments.
Por haber acudido.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to thank you for coming.
Que, bueno, las consultas que nos
I hope that the questions that you asked us, that we actually managed to answer them. Sometimes talking about security is, I wouldn't say that it's taboo, but there are a number of questions that you don't feel like asking in public. So should that be the case, please, you have our email addresses, you can reach us, and we will gladly get back to you, or maybe, set up a call or something. And thank you so much for your time for coming today. Silvia? Yeah, thanks to you all. Thanks for coming. I have a couple of things that I wrote down and suggestions as well for for our security team to, well, improve.
Genial, muchas gracias, Silvia. Yo antes del cierre lo que les quería comentar.
Okay, so before we close this session, I would like to tell you that we have migrated all our forums to Stack Overflow. You have the links on the chat. If you have any questions, comments, you can always use this tool, which is where we are doing most of our work. So thank you all for your participation, Gerardo and Silvia in particular for this presentation, and all of you for participating. We have a great number of events before the end of the year like this, so look forward to seeing you there.